Lorynn Divita is an associate professor of family and consumer sciences at Baylor University and a 2013 to 2014 recipient of the Baylor Fellows Award for Innovative Teaching. She sat down with us to discuss her book, Fashion Forecasting. A fun and insightful text, it teaches readers how to anticipate emerging trends in the industry and to prepare and present their own fashion forecast. This episode will cover a wide range of topics, including cultural appropriation, trend setting, economic status and affordability, style tribes throughout history, and much more. Take a listen. Welcome to the Bloomsbury Academic Podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Moravsky, and today I'm here with Lorynn Divita, the author of Fashion Forecasting. So welcome. Thanks for being on the show, Lorynn.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Just to get started, what drove you to write this book, Fashion Forecasting, in the first place?
Well, I was fortunate enough to assume Baylor University's fashion forecasting class back in 2011 from a dear colleague who had taught it for years prior. And in the process of prepping for the course, I realized that it was just my great love. It was absolutely my passion. And I really worked hard to come up with a list of engaging activities and also extra readings for the students to do. And so I started thinking, I really had some ideas that I would like to share with an audience larger than just my class of 25 students. And so it just happened to be fantastic timing that the author of editions 1 through 3 of Fashion Forecasting was coming upon retirement and had expressed that she was no longer interested in updating the book. And I expressed my interest right at the same time that she had said she would no longer be updating. And after an interview process and several months of discussions, I was really thrilled to be able to be given the contract to update the 4th and now 5th edition. And it really has been a labor of love because I just think it's the most dynamic and fascinating topic and relevant to everyone, whether you realize it or not.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's the thing, is that your discipline is so public facing. I mean, fashion is important to so many people, not just academics. And, we throw around these terms, and therefore we throw around a lot of terminology within the fashion industry. But I think it's important to ground some of these terms in actual theory. So on that note, I mean, what exactly is a trend and how do they work in the fashion system?
Oh, absolutely. So we know that a fashion is just a style that is popular in the present, and it's something that's adopted by a group of people. Fashion is a group behavior. It's not an individual behavior by definition. And a trend is broader than that. It's defined as a transitory increase or decrease in popularity over time. And we're used to hearing trends discussed in terms of fashion, but really we see trends in all aspects of life. Anything that has to do with aesthetics. It can be, the type of music that's popular. It can be architectural styles. It can be food and cuisine. And it's really everything that involves tastes of style and expression. Which is why when we look back at what we formerly liked and was formerly popular, we tend to cringe because it really is very closely connected to a particular era or moment in time, and times change.
But sometimes those trends get recycled.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. In fact, that's a subject of the book in chapter 5. The theorist James Laver actually crafted a timeline, and it has to do with a trend from going after popularity, being perceived as dowdy, and then eventually, many years later, originally being introduced as ironic, but coming full circle to then being daring, but then once again, as it's accepted by the mainstream, considered beautiful. So the only difference, he crafted the timeline in the 1940s, and thanks to technology, the process has sped up, but the underlying basis for it is completely unchanged.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed that within my own fashion sense. I wear a lot of sort of throwback 90s outfits now with like blue wash jeans and some Adidas's, and denim on denim is suddenly cool again.
And, there are internal and external reasons for that, but probably one of the big reasons for it is that, fashion is generally for, the young, and the up and coming influential designers, their tastes were formed when they were young. So many of them were really becoming observant and noticing fashion in the 90s. And now that they are finally in a position to express themselves in these positions, such as creative director, and actually have a real say in the aesthetic of their brand, they're going back to what they love. And a lot of it is based in the 90s for the current crop.
Along those lines, what exactly is the life cycle of a trend, and how does it play out among people? I guess in this particular case, young people mostly.
Sure. Trends, I think the thing that most people don't realize is that trends have been studied to such an extent that we really can predict the life cycle of a trend. And there are various ways you can do that. But the one that I really like is really simple. And it comes from an article that was actually about cigars originally when it was written. And it breaks down the trend life cycle. And the first stage is fringe. And in the fringe, some outsider culture has a signature look or style or item. And it's very cool. Most people, it's a little too edgy for them. And so the basic idea of their look then gets co-opted by the trendsetters. And it goes from being fringe with these kind of outsider people to trendy with these trendsetters and people who are at the very early stages of the fashion bell curve. And they are the ones that are willing to take the risks. And even when they take the risks, though, they will probably take a little bit of the edge out of that trend to make it slightly more palatable and not quite so intimidating. Well, after they've had it for a very short time, they will move on, but they've popularized it enough, whether they're influencers who people have seen them on Instagram, or they're just people who have a reputation in their school or social group, and people look to them for leadership. And the trend then becomes mainstream. And when moving from trendy to mainstream, once again, it's going to lose its edge. If it is just, extremely daring, something will happen that sort of mutes that impact a little bit. But that's what makes it more palatable to a large, widespread audience. And at that point, the people who are on the fringe are probably still doing it because they're not going to be swayed by it. But the people who are trendy have moved on to something entirely different. And then it invariably comes to the end of its mainstream life cycle as new things are introduced. And at that point, the trend either will mutate and somehow become a little bit different, or it will just go away for a while until it comes back as a retro fashion. So, for example, like that 90s hip hop, it started out very identified with one group. And as it became more mainstream and popular, some of the really distinctive characteristics of it were kind of downplayed in favor of things like just bright colors or just oversized. And it went away, but now, as you see, it's coming back.
I mean, the way that you're describing a life cycle trend clearly has some social and political implications. The example you use being like 90s hip hop. And so, I mean, some people would call it cultural appropriation, right? Like, borrowing something from the margins and then introducing it in a more palatable form to mainstream culture. I mean, can you explain exactly what cultural appropriation is and how you approach it in your book?
Oh, absolutely. Well, the thing that I do mention is that the basis of all fashion is just the concept of appropriation. All fashion or fashion trends spreading are based on someone seeing a new or novel look, deciding, I like that, I can do that, and then reinterpreting it themselves or purchasing something similar. So really, all fashion is appropriation or copying to some degree. Cultural appropriation occurs when a very significant style or item or look that is associated with a very particular group, when it becomes appropriated by the larger group, becomes more affiliated with that new group than with the originators, who often aren't even given credit as the originators of the look. And that's where it gets real dicey. It basically is not giving credit where credit is due. And the big question that people frequently ask me is, well, what is the line between inspiration and appropriation? And it's a very fine line, but it can be done. And basically, it's where you take select items or something like a color scheme or colors or patterns, but use them in an entirely new and novel way. That is inspiration. It is when you do an exact copy. And the big thing where some people have been getting a lot of negative press for it is some designers have been taking just exact replicas of traditional garments that can be purchased in those native countries where they're from for a very small amount of money, not changing any of the design details at all, just replicating them and then selling them for a hugely inflated price. And that is where it causes controversy, because they are basically not crediting the source, just imitating it entirely and not using it as the creation of something new and different.
And profiting off of it.
Yeah. Oh, extensively. One designer that had a problem, Michael Kors, had a collection that used some pullovers that could be purchased. They were of Mexican origin, and they could be purchased for very inexpensively. But the version on the runway, that was, again, just you wouldn't be able to distinguish between the two from a distance, because they were a line for line copy, was retailing for, 100 times that price. So that's where it gets really complicated. And the industry is still learning how to adapt to this, because appropriation was done as recently as the 70s. Yves Saint Laurent did an entire collection based on Africa, and it was, by any definition, appropriation. And of course, at the time, no one thought anything of it. No one thought anything of it at all. So it is an adjustment for some of the older members of the industry to have to start thinking in these terms. But it's not as complicated, I think, for the younger members of the fashion industry.
Right. I mean, it's not even just it's obviously an issue for people who work within the fashion industry, but also just consumers of the fashion industry. Like, when I think about the Woodstock aesthetic, the 1960s hippie aesthetic, it was all borrowed from, Native American imagery, like people wearing, that was sort of the original Coachella look, if you will.
Oh, well, absolutely. Well, at the time, those people were attempting to show an anti-consumerist ethos, and they were doing that by buying either old clothing from thrift stores or by buying them from import stores. And they were showing their lack of participation in the Western fashion system by buying these items that were imported from other countries, or they were buying stuff from the Army Navy surplus store. And unfortunately, what happened was it was a clear example of a concept I talk about in Chapter 3, trickle up. And the young people were doing it. So all of a sudden, you've got designers like Ossie Clark and, again, Yves Saint Laurent, who are selling caftans that are inspired by actual caftans that are made in other, cultures, and are quite economical, because that's traditional wear, but they're showing them on runways and charging exorbitant amounts for it. So it's been happening ever since then. It's just, we're finally now starting to turn our attention to it in a way that we had sort of just overlooked the unpleasantness of this before. And also the cycle time from Woodstock to Coachella, if you look at Labor's timeline, it just, again, a happy occurrence. Music festivals had not, large multi-day music festivals had not been on the cultural radar, and, the timeline changed, and they thought it was a good idea to reintroduce it. And because Woodstock really set our idea of what this is what you wear to a music festival looked like, everybody sort of turned to that for their style and appearance cues to attend. And it really started off as, just sort of using Woodstock not only as the guideline for the event, but also for what you would wear as an attendee.
Do you think that the discourse around cultural appropriation is moving in the right direction?
Oh, absolutely. I think talking about it is the first step. And I think people are being more deliberate with their choices and are more contemplative when making some choices about, what inspires me about this culture and how will I convey that inspiration. Banana Republic actually did a collection several years ago that was inspired by India, and it got huge accolades because they said, this is how you do it right. They used a color palette that clearly had a basis in Indian culture and some patterns, but they used them in completely different and novel and innovative ways to show that, yes, this is where we got the original source idea, but we are taking it and transforming it into something new, which is what fashion is at its best. At its best, it is novel, and it fills humans' basic need for novelty and innovation and creativity and self-expression.
I mean, I completely agree with you about that. You've talked a little bit about the trickle-up theory or the life cycle of a fashion trend. I don't think that people are the public is as aware of how much academic theory is actually grounded in fashion. Could you talk a little bit about other popular theories that are out there?
Sure, absolutely. For being derided as such a frivolous pursuit, fashion has been studied by some pretty great minds. And one of the originators of fashion theory is actually a Harvard economist named Thorstein Veblen. And he wrote a whole book based on fashion, and it's called The Theory of the Leisure Class. It came out in 1899. And since then, it really set the standard for sort of defining just fashion theory and how we characterize mass behavior through fashion choices. And he came up with the term conspicuous consumption. That was sort of the major breakthrough of his book. And conspicuous consumption, it's so simple, you almost can't believe that it took somebody to state it clearly, but it really did. And all conspicuous consumption says is rich people flaunt their wealth through a highly extravagant lifestyle, which can include, the number of clothes they have, the type of clothes they have, the material these clothes are made out of, and just it's funny because, it's more than 100 years old, but it absolutely still holds true today. If you look at anyone's Instagram, that's all that is conveying this idea of, not anyone, of course, but the rich and affluent spend their time conveying this to their followers.
Yeah, especially even with like influencer culture.
Yes, that's all it is. Yeah, and it's fascinating because one thing that we're seeing now is all status is being derived not just from possessing the item, but now status comes from not having to pay for the item. Previously, in conspicuous consumption, people were happy to show that they could afford these items. Now people are trying to flaunt or craft the impression that they were gifted to them by the brand, because that's how much esteem they're held in. And so some brands have found that people are putting hashtag spawn or hashtag ad next to items that they did not gift, to give the impression that they are so influential that the brand actually gave them merchandise that they did not, which is a very unique problem. It's a very 21st century situation, I'm sure, for brands to have to deal with people not wanting to admit that they bought the product, but instead intimating that it was given to them.
I mean, yeah, just because it's a different form of cultural capital that we're being introduced to in the digital age, right? That, people would gift you their products so that you could influence other people on Instagram. Like, you're just so prominent that you don't even have to pay for the clothes. I mean, it's bizarre.
Yeah, absolutely. 100 years ago or more in Veblen's day, the height of social status would be that you had the money to purchase these items, and that would be flaunting your wealth. Well, now flaunting your wealth is such that, I don't have to pay for these items. So it's a real shift, but the basic motivation is exactly the same.
Right. It's not just that I think you can afford it, but you don't have to pay, but also that your influence transcends like actual monetary wealth, that you have such a popular influence over the public that whatever you wear could actually make waves in the fashion industry.
Yeah, definitely. And it's very unique. So that first initial work actually gave rise to a whole host of follow-up works by researchers like George Simmel and just lots of others, Laver, who I mentioned before. And they ended up coming up with additional theories or related theories. And so while Veblen pioneered conspicuous consumption, that sort of gave rise to the idea of trickle down. And that means that the rich set the fashion trends, and at the time, there was an actual lag time before middle class and ultimately lower class people could afford these looks. And they would then eventually be reinterpreted, these styles, at a lower price point. And by that point, the rich would have then moved on to something else. And that whole model was true for quite some time. But then around the 1960s, we had the youthquake and the whole right around the Woodstock era, swinging London and mods in the 1960s. And youth really became the big commodity. And because young people did not have, great amounts of wealth, the whole idea of status changed from trickle down to trickle up. And it was street fashion really became influential. And that's what I was alluding to earlier too, when you would see versions of kaftans that young people bought in an attempt to be anti-consumerist, reinterpreted on the fashion runway and selling for thousands of dollars. That's an example of trickle up, taking the fashion of the street and reinterpreting it at a high end for a wealthy consumer. So there's that. And then there actually is also a trickle across, which is really more inside a social class, how there are trendsetters inside a social class and a look can spread across a group. And I mean, we see that all the time. I'm at a university. There's a pretty significant sorority population, and I can just watch as a trend will spread across this particular group, all of whom are approximately the same economic status, social status, and I just watch a trend ripple through this whole swath of people, and it's very interesting to watch as the trend catches on.
What's a trend that you've noticed recently at your university?
Particularly branding, particular brands have a great hold on certain populations of our students. There's a brand that is in Austin, and it enjoyed a massive popularity. And they were known for brightly colored tile earrings that you could purchase in just a bajillion different colors. And I sort of watched as first one or two women in my class would have these earrings, and then all of a sudden 4 or 5 women would have it. And then it just seemed like everybody had it. And then after a while, eventually everyone said, oh, I'm just tired of that. So that's an example. These kind of, I don't know that it spread much outside of Texas, but it got very, very popular here, particularly these really brightly colored chunky tile earrings that were made. And it was at the point where people would just say, oh, are those? And people would just say, oh, yeah, because everybody knew. They're instantly recognizable.
It is amazing to actually physically watch that sort of ripple effect happen across campus like that. It's like having your own little fashion incubator to apply all of your theories.
It's true. And if you know about fashion theory, it's not surprising, because trends that are highly visible catch on faster than trends that are not highly visible, which is earrings are extremely noticeable and visible. So of course an earring trend would be very quick to catch on. Trends that are impermanent tend to catch on faster. For example, earrings are very low risk, low economic risk. They were not prohibitively expensive, low social risk. If you decide you don't like them, you can take them out. And just the fact that they really were the perfect beacon to watch as they gained and lost popularity, because they were low commitment, low risk, low cost, and highly visible. So if it's going to take off, that sort of removes all those barriers to adoption. Unlike something that's extreme, like a handbag trend, and the handbag is $1,000. Some people might want to participate in that trend, but it's just not feasible. This, however, it's open to all. So it was fun to watch it kind of build and crest and decline.
Is there a trend recently that you've witnessed that you've been really into personally and have taken on yourself?
I'm not going to lie. The whole leopard midi skirt is... I have one, and it helps that I've always been a fan of leopard, so it didn't cause any convincing for me. But it's not necessarily. It's leopard midi dresses and skirts are currently very, very popular. But because I wanted to make sure that when I talked earlier about a trend, after it reaches its maximum, it has to either evolve and change or it goes away. My leopard print midi skirt is ice blue. It's not natural leopard print, but yeah. And I will tell you, I think I've worn it 3 times this semester so far, and I always get a college student complimenting me on it every time I wear it, every single time.
Because it sounds amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing. Yes. I ordered it it came from New York. I could not find it. I had to order it from Bloomingdale's, and they shipped it because Waco is not on the cutting edge of trends. So it also stands out.
So, you talk a lot about trends and different theories based in fashion, but and you also discussed the whole evolution of how fashion forecasting came to be in your book. Could you go a little bit about the actual evolution of the forecasting industry itself?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Fashion forecasting did not exist in its current form. It hasn't existed in its current form for terribly long. But people have always had an interest in knowing what the upper class are wearing. And that started back in the days of the court of Louis XIV. And the publication started with illustrations fashion plates, and it was called Le Mercure Galant. And people would purchase this, take it to their dressmaker, and then have fashions made that resembled those of the court. And in order to do that, a lot of textile manufacturers also sort of helped along the trend process by coming up with small books, swatch books or swatch cards, where new fabrics and textiles would be available for people, designers, dressmakers to see and touch and get an idea of what the trends would be. And still today, the textile industry really is the source of a lot of new trends, because there are some pretty significant shows, and one is Premier Vision, and that is in Paris, although there are also regional, smaller regional Premier Visions held around the world. And then in Italy, there's Pitti Filati, and that's another textile show. And so designers will go there to see what the innovations in textiles are, and while they're there, they'll also get an idea of what textures and fabrications and also colors are going to be important in the near future. And several of them use the fabric as the springboard for their designs and lines and the collections they design. The idea of forecasting in its traditional sense that we would recognize it, where you have someone helping to connect the dots for people and understand what they envision as being popular, that really happened in the 1920s. A woman named Toby Collier Davis started her company, the Toby Report, and she would just write up a little newsletter and sell it to industry members that would tell retailers what important trends she saw on the horizon. And in a way, it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. No retailer wants to be left behind, so they receive the trend forecast, and then they make sure that they have those items, and then they hit. So yes, there is a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy aspect to it, but we live in an era now where you cannot force a trend. There are so many trends out there. And there is a sociologist named Herbert Bloomer. And it was Bloomer who came up with the idea of collective selection. And that is, there are so many competing trends out there. Individuals can pick or choose, or even wait until there's something that's more to their liking. And there is no monolithic trend anymore that is, that the designer from up on high says, you will wear this and everyone follows. Those days are gone. The power resides in the consumer now. So really, you can hope to make that a trend will hit, and you can do things to encourage its adoption, like increase its visibility and lower barriers to its adoption, like, keeping the price affordable. But really, at the end of the day, it's the consumer who decides what is and isn't a trend.
Right, especially because in the digital world, everything, all identity has become so fragmented. I mean, I think even in this country, we exist in completely different truth spheres. The way that some people listen to Fox is like a totally different existence than somebody who listens or reads the New York Times, right? But I mean, and that could be said, the same could be said about the emergence of different fashion trends, which I think you touch upon in a really interesting way by talking about what you call style tribes.
Yes.
What exactly are style tribes, and how, if at all, does it differentiate from like fashion subculture?
The British author Ted Polhemus is the anthropologist who came up with the term style tribes, and he did it decades ago. And the ones that he wrote about were primarily British and primarily had a musical influence to them. So he is the one who coined the term. And a style tribe is a group of people who choose to adopt an appearance style to show that group affiliation. One group that is fairly popular down in Austin is like a rockabilly influence. People who drive cars from the 1950s. The men wear cuffed jeans and boots and plaid shirts with white T-shirts underneath, and they style their hair in a retro style. And the women in the group kind of all look like the pinup girl Betty Page, with dark hair and thick bangs and cat eye glasses and things like that. There is no barrier to that entry. All you need to do is be an aficionado of the music and aesthetic and just sort of the lifestyle of the 50s and early 60s, and start dressing that way. And boom, you can be a member of that style tribe. Subcultures are a little bit different in that they are groups of almost always young people, and they have chosen not to adhere to the norms of the mainstream and to show their refusal to adhere to it through their dress. And the best example of this, of course, would be punks from the 1970s. That's the obvious example. And as I said, Veblen's conspicuous consumption led to all these related theories. And one researcher coined the term conspicuous outrage. And that is really what punks were showing through their dress, that they were not going to adhere. And generally, subcultures, the term sub does mean under, and these are not wealthy groups of young people. They tend to be working class young people, and they choose deliberately to distinguish themselves through their clothing and their music and just other values that they have. So the thing I do always try to clarify to my students is, in my perception, the hippies do not meet the criteria to be considered a subculture, because a lot of the hippies were middle class and even upper class young people. They were just rebelling against their parents, but they didn't have that same underclass situation. So hippies are usually described as the counterculture. They were against the norm, but they were not choosing not to adhere to it in the same way as a subculture would. For a long time, hippie culture became mainstream culture. Just the aesthetic and the idealism in the late 60s, early 70s. It really did take on a mainstream popularity.
Right, and as you said, so many of the people that propagated the hippie movement were benefiting from mainstream culture because they were a part of it and were recognized by it. So,
oh yeah. So I would say probably the main thing, a lot of style tribes also have a music genre that is closely associated with them. So for example, let's see, I'm trying to think, what's a good one? Well, there's the TED. One of the earliest style tribes is called the Teds, and they were in London, and they dressed in a variation of Edwardian fashion, and they had their own music to go with it. Also, for example, the mod subculture started also in London. They had bands that they liked jazz. They like jazz, and they were really a good example of a whole lifestyle, which included, even though they were British, they had a very continental appearance. So Italian Vespas and very slim cut French or Italian suits for the young men. They'd wear parkas over them so that their immaculate suits would not get dirty while they rode their Vespas. Absolutely. And yeah, exactly. A great love of Italian coffee, French New Wave cinema, and like I said, jazz music. So it's more than just a look. It's a whole lifestyle.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like a chicken and the egg kind of thing. I mean, you say that often these style tribes are associated with some form of popular culture. Do you think it's just popular culture or something like that? Is that really the only real influence on cultural trends today?
I'm hard pressed to think of an example that is not affiliated with popular culture. A lot of trends that are affiliated with high culture, for example, like if an artist will do a collaboration with a brand, those tend to still be at the very highest levels of society. So I would say, yeah, I think it's still very heavily popular culture. The influence is primarily popular culture. One style tribe that I think is just so fun is steampunk. And they're fun because they don't have a particularly musical genre associated with them, but they do have a literary genre. Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, reimagined in the present day, is just kind of neat. It's this kind of neat sci-fi offshoot that also has a lot of Western influence in it and some very innovative technology too, which is just, it's a lot of fun.
For people who don't really know what steampunk is, can you describe what that aesthetic looks like a little bit?
Sure. What it is, and it's interesting because we see it depicted in popular culture. Just a lot of people might not be able to pinpoint it if they did see it. Probably one of the films that really had a steampunk aesthetic, although it wasn't specifically described as that, was the Will Smith movie Wild Wild West, the remake of that. It was very much a steampunk aesthetic based on that look. But steampunk takes the idea of this Victorian era fashion and technology and sort of reimagines what would modern technology look like if it evolved, but we still used the building blocks and materials from the Victorian era. So they get just phenomenally creative with imaginary weapons that look old, just pretend weapons, but also they will make their modern technology look like it is old. For example, you can buy steampunk phone cases. I've seen examples of making a laptop look kind of like an old-time typewriter with gears and mechanisms on it. And the clothing has a definite Edwardian / Wild West influence. It has a Wild West influence in part because a lot of steampunk originated from the West Coast of California, but also just it sort of mingled with this Jules Verne era style as well. So a lot of overcoats and top hats and leather and corsets, but they all look retro futuristic. It's just a lot of fun. I think it's really cool.
Have you ever tried doing any kind of steampunk fashion?
I'm just a fan. That's what I like to say. I'm not a participant, but I'm a fan and an observer. And so I enjoy watching from the sidelines. My dress is pretty darn indistinct. It's indistinct. I don't really stand out through my clothing because I enjoy blending in and watching and surreptitiously taking photos. That's where I get my enjoyment, being the spectator.
But was there at any point in your life where you did sort of participate in one of these style tribes?
Oh, yeah, because I was young. Yeah. As a young person, I participated. It would be very easy to find me and a group of friends in our all black with my dark lipstick and my dyed hair from the late 80s. I always jokingly describe myself as I was kind of goth light, but I certainly enjoyed I definitely like the bands of that era, and a lot of goth, which is a lot of fun because goth is great because for a variety of reasons. It's great because it's both a music genre. There's goth artists, and many of whom are still popular today. It's also great because, yes, it's also based in literature, like certain books like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is sort of, the standard. But also because a lot of people leave their subculture behind as they grow, but goths, more than any other subculture, will stay within the style tribe, yet mature. And so they jokingly call them elder goths, which I think is so cute. So elder goths. And so elder goths are the ones that have enough money to be able to participate in things like the Whitby Goth Festival that is held in England. And people travel from all over and wear just these incredible outfits and spend time just enjoying each other's company and strolling in their incredible outfits, and also listening to artists perform. So it sounds like just a terrific lot of fun. I think that's great. So I definitely have some old incriminating photos from those days, and I still love The Cure. Gotta love The Cure.
I mean, who doesn't? I mean, that's like every sad girl's Friday night, or like just
I would
every
say,
time you want to feel sad about yourself.
Yeah, one of the best things I got to do was in 2018. I was fortunate enough to go to their Hyde Park 40th anniversary concert, and 65,000 people attended. And it was just one of the most incredible shows of my life, but I hadn't seen them in a very long time. And it was a lot of fun. And yes, lots of elder goths present. I will say that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that the longevity of a trend or a tribe is based on whatever their core idea is, or what you call a core concept, in the sense that steampunk is based on a core concept of the Edwardian era, or goth is based on a core concept of it's based on like the Gothic tradition and other mediums like literature and art, right? But I think once again, I'm so sorry, just the idea popped in my head. I think once again, it really also comes back to that idea of, does the trend mutate or adapt? And we really saw this with goth when the whole idea of cyber goth came out, so it had that core concept of goth, but it looked totally innovative. And then for a while, Alexander Wang, who's a very high-end designer, he did an entire collection, runway collection, and it was described as health goth. And it was this really cool, edgy stuff, but it was combined with athleisure, and that was pretty amazing. So there's there's variants on it that keep it fresh and lively. Mod as a subculture, while it still is identifiable, it really has changed a lot. And those subcultures that don't modify and change are the ones that kind of end up not being super relevant in the future and are just kind of forgotten. An example of that would be, beatniks. We know what a beatnik looks like: the black turtleneck, the black pants. And we saw it go from fringe to trendy to mainstream when Audrey Hepburn's character, they didn't call her a beatnik in Funny Face, but she clearly was modeled after a beatnik girl. But the whole look did not evolve. And so beatniks didn't even really merit a mention in the book because they aren't that influential relative to more dynamic style tribes that we still see in some form or another today. Yeah, I do have to admit that there are probably some incriminating photos of me online dressing up as a quote unquote health goth in college.
Very cool.
Went to some health goth parties in college. It's very fun. It's basically a haven for indie liberal kids, right?
Yeah.
That were probably a little emo in high school.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And so a lot of people, there's a debate. Are style tribes dead, other than sort of these core that I talk about in the book that still have adherents? Are there any new style tribes? Do new style tribes exist? And I would say that they do, but like so much else, they tend to be perhaps a little bit faster now. And so scene kids and emo kids, I mean, those are clear examples of style tribes, but they just sort of hit a little bit faster and went out a little bit quicker than something from the 1970s that took a really long time because of technology and communication to spread. So, but I think they're still out there. I'm very tired already of these articles about the Visco girl, and that is, with scrunchies and Vans and hydro flasks and puka shell necklaces and stuff. And it's more fatiguing because I have a 12-year-old who has devoted her life to looking like this. I mean, that's all she wants to do. So it's perhaps, I mean, I support it, obviously. I'm not going to be one to tell her not to, participate in the fashion system. But I think where I'm a little troubled by it is Visco girls are so reliant on a particular brand. And that, I would say, is a new thing. Before, it was just a style. Now it's not just a style. It has to be a particular brand. And that, to me, smacks of corporatization, Right. So I don't know. We'll have to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I mean, you're touching upon something really important, that fashion in the 21st century is now fundamentally shaped by the internet and also by late capitalism in a way that it never was before. How does that actually impact designers? How, if the fashion trending process is so much faster than it ever was before, how do designers find inspiration in trends, and how do they actually gather information from consumers that could be involved or could be included in a forecast if things move so rapidly?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of my students are very surprised at fashion forecasting not being intuition. And I always tell people, you are not looking for a needle in a haystack. You don't want that. You are looking for the big picture. Fashion forecasting does not want this one little tiny thing hidden. You are trying to make connections and synthesize those connections down into ideas that you can readily communicate. So no, you're not looking for this one little thing. You're trying to make sense of the big picture, the whole thing. So we spend a lot of our time looking at the zeitgeist, which is a German noun that means spirit of our times. And that is another concept that was made by yet another academic back in the 1920s. His name is Nystrom. And he coined the zeitgeist as a way to understand the current times and fashion as a part of that. So we spend a lot of our time actually researching, what are the dominant events that our present day is known for, and what are our dominating social groups, who has the power, and what are our dominating ideals, what do we as a society value, and by contrast, what are our dominating attitudes, what do we feel about things, are we cynical about them, or are we positive towards a topic, and finally, what is our dominating technology. And my students spend a good long period of time assessing these things and then really trying in concrete ways to project how each of these 5 factors might influence fashion in the next year. And it could be everything from particular slogan tees or protest tees to color, taking on a particular color as a symbol, having prominence, or a particular item gaining significance. And we just try to anticipate how will all these things show up in fashion in the next 6 months to a year.
We only have time for one more question, but on that note, as a fashion forecaster, I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of forecasting now. I mean, do you have any predictions for the next 5 years or so? Like, what would you actually like to see?
Things that I think are going to be important, and we're already seeing this, so I'm sorry, I'm probably not going to give you your money's worth, but we are, for so long, we've been considering our food, and I feel like we've really turned our attention to the conditions and caliber of our food. And I think now we're going to start seeing our apparel being eyed with the same level of scrutiny. And thing that's sort of all coming together is environmentalism, obviously, is a bigger topic now than it has been in a very long time. And people are being asked to consider their consumption patterns. And also that sort of dovetails with this whole minimalist Marie Kondo's art of tidying up. And so we sort of have this whole idea of making environmentally ethical choices and not wasting resources, combined with this ideal of minimalism. So we've got these two things going. And I think that will hopefully result in people making more deliberate choices. For so long, cost has been a primary driver of clothing purchase. I bought it because it's cheap, very low economic barrier. What I am hoping will happen, and there are a couple of brands that are doing it, and they're literally promoting, yes, we are a costly brand, but you will get value for this, and buy some, it will last, buy some, you will love it, you will continue to love it. This will be a staple of your wardrobe for years to come. So I do hope that we will see an impetus to a higher quality, an insistence on higher quality, and on styles that I would describe as transcending fads and in and out, and instead people thinking more in terms of building a wardrobe that communicates who they are, as opposed to just buying lots of different looks and discarding them as soon as they fall apart because the quality is so low, or because of planned obsolescence, they've just decided that it's out, which is something a forecaster would never do. A forecaster knows that if anyone's wearing it, it's still in. So don't let anybody tell you something's out, because that is sort of just a editorial concept for a fashion magazine. Yeah. Well, if someone's wearing it, it's in.
Yeah, well, that's super reassuring. Well, this has been lovely. I'm Rebecca Morawski on Bloomsbury Academics podcast, talking to Lorynn Divita, author of Fashion Forecasting. You can find her book at Bloomsbury's website. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Rebecca. It was a real pleasure.